I have obeyed every rule I was ever given, every one. I obeyed my father's rules, and then my husband's rules, and then the rules of the county, and the rules of the church, and the rules that women in my time were expected to follow without being told they were rules, which are the hardest ones of all because you cannot point to them and say this is wrong. You can only feel the walls around you when you try to move in a direction you are not supposed to move. I have been a good woman by every measure that was ever put to me. I have been obedient and silent and careful and good. But there is one thing I was forbidden to speak about. One thing, told to me when I was 7 years old, pressed into me like a brand that does not show on the skin, and I obeyed that silence for 80 years. 80 years of carrying the one true thing about my family and never saying it out loud, and by the time I understood what the silence had cost me, the only person I could have told it to was already in the ground. I am 87 years old. I have nothing left to lose by saying it, and I am going to say it now. I was born in February of 1838, Eastern Tennessee, Round County, on a farm about 5 miles south of a town called Kingston, which sat at the confluence of the Clinch River and the Tennessee River and smelled of river mud and sawmill timber and the particular sweetness of river bottom land in summer. My father's name was Preston Saylor. He ran cattle, which he drove each autumn to a market in Knoxville, 80 miles to the northeast, on roads that were passable in dry weather and miserable in wet. He got between $12 and $15 a head in good years, less in bad, and we had perhaps 40 head at any given time, and we were comfortable in the way that means no one is hungry, and some years there is something left over. The house was 6 miles from any neighbor worth calling a neighbor. That distance was normal, and it was also, I have thought since, deliberate. My father was a man who liked distance between himself and other people, not from coldness, from something else, something I did not have a word for when I was a child and can only now name as watchfulness. He watched people. He took the measure of them before he committed to any kind of closeness, and by the time he had taken their measure, he often found reasons to keep the distance he had started with. My mother's name was Cora. She was a tall woman, angular, not beautiful in the conventional way, but with a quality of presence that you noticed when she came into a room, a quality that had to do with the way she held herself and the way she looked at things directly, which was not universal in women in those years. She had been born in North Carolina and had come to Tennessee at 18 to marry my father, whom she had not met until she arrived, the marriage having been arranged through a family connection, and she had met him and apparently decided he was acceptable within the course of a single Sunday afternoon, which tells you something about either her powers of observation or her options. There were two of us children. My brother Clement, who was born in 1835, 3 years before me, and me. Just the two. My name is Ern Porter, the one the family Bible, the one the Fagway children know, things that have been half said and never fully explained. And I did not ask about it because even at a very young age I understood that certain questions were not asked in our house. That understanding that certain questions were not asked was the earliest form of the rule. Clement was 3 years older and considerably larger, and he took after our father in the watchful, quiet way, the way of boys who absorb the manner of the men they live nearest to and reflect it back without being aware they are doing it. He and I were close in the specific way of children who have no other children within a mile, and who therefore become each other's entire social world whether they choose to or not. We were not alike in temperament. He was contained, and I was not contained. He thought before he spoke, and I spoke before I thought, and he was frequently correct, and I was frequently in trouble for things I had said before the thinking happened. But we were close. We were as close as two children can be when they are the only children in a house that has rules about what can be said. Now I have to tell you about my father's sister. Her name was Violet, Violet Saylor, though by the time I knew her she was Violet Meade, having married a man named Edmund Meade sometime around 1833. She lived in Rowan County, too, about 12 miles west of us, which was far enough that we saw her perhaps 4 or 5 times a year. At Christmas and at harvest time, and occasionally in between when something drew the families together. She was 10 years younger than my father, and she had none of his watchfulness and none of his distance. She was the kind of person who arrived in a room the way weather arrives, filling it completely, bringing the temperature up by her presence alone. She laughed easily and often. She asked questions freely and received the answers with a quality of genuine interest that made you feel whatever you had said was exactly the most interesting thing she had heard all week. She brought food when she came, always more than was needed, pies and preserved things, and bread still warm from her own oven, 12 miles away, and she set it out on our table as though feeding people was her natural and preferred state of being. I adored her. From the earliest age I can remember, I adored Violet completely and without reservation. My father did not like her visiting. This was not something he said. It was something he showed, in the way that silent, watchful people show things, which is through a quality of stillness that becomes denser when the thing they do not like is present. He would be at the table when Violet arrived, and he would stand and receive her with the correct formalities, and then he would find reasons to be elsewhere for the duration of her visit, in the barn or in the far field or simply not visible, and he would return when she had gone with the particular quality of a man who has waited out something unpleasant. I noticed this when I was very young. I did not understand it. My mother never explained it. She received Violet warmly. She always received Violet warmly. And when my father was not in the room, she was easy and glad, and laughed the way she did not often laugh when he was present. But if I asked about my father's absence, she would say only that he had work to attend to. And if I pressed, she would look at me with the particular look that meant the question had reached its permitted distance and I was not to push further. So I did not push further. I stored the question in the place where children store the things they have been taught not to ask about, and the store of it grew over years. And I carried it alongside the love I had for Violet the way you sometimes carry contradictory things without resolution. In the summer of 1845, when I was 7 years old, Violet came to visit on a Saturday in July. I remember the month because the hay had just been cut, and the smell of cut hay was in everything. That particular green sweet smell that is one of the best smells in the world, if you were raised in farming country. She came alone, without Edmund, which was unusual, and she was not as light as she usually was, which I noticed immediately because any deviation from Violet's usual lightness was notable. She and my mother sat on the bench outside the kitchen door for most of the afternoon. I was in the yard with Clement doing whatever children do in yards in July, and I was near enough to hear them speak, but not near enough to hear the words, only the tone of it, which was lower and more serious than Violet's usual tone, and once or twice I heard my mother say something in a way that sounded like a warning, and I saw Violet look down at her hands. My father came out of the barn at some point in the late afternoon. He saw Violet and he stopped, and something passed between them, some quality of air, and then he went back into the barn without speaking to her. And Violet watched him go with an expression I did not have a word for at 7 years old and can now name as grief. She left before supper. She hugged my mother for a long time at the door. She hugged Clement. She hugged me, and when she hugged me, she held me perhaps a moment longer than usual, and she said in my ear in a low voice, "You are a good girl, Susanna. You have always been a good girl." I said goodbye and watched her wagon go up the road in the late afternoon light. She did not come back. Not that autumn. Not at Christmas, which was the first Christmas in my memory without her. I asked my mother in December where Violet would be for Christmas, and my mother said Violet and Edmund were spending Christmas with Edmund's people this year. And I accepted this and waited for the next occasion that would bring her. The next occasion did not come. I asked about her in the spring of 1846. My mother said she was well. I asked about her the following Christmas, and my mother said she was well. I asked my father once, in the early spring of 1846, where Violet had gone, and he looked at me with a look I'd never seen on his face before, a look that was not cold and was not warm and was something in between that contained both, a look that took the measure of my question, the way he took the measure of everything. And then he said, "Your Aunt Violet will not be visiting us, and I want you to understand that we do not speak of her." That was the rule. Said aloud once in the early spring of 1846, when I was 7 years old, "We do not speak of her." I did not ask again. Clement did not ask. My mother did not offer. And Violet, who had been as regular a presence in my life as the seasons, was simply gone, as though she had been removed from the picture with careful hands, every trace of her lifted, nothing remaining except the empty space where she had been, and the memory of cut hay and her voice in my ear on a July afternoon. I obeyed that rule for 40 years. 40 years. From 1846 to 1886, I did not speak Violet's name in my father's house. I did not ask where she was, or what had happened, or what could possibly have been large enough to require the complete erasure of a person from a family's life and the silence of an entire household. Around the erasure, I carried the question the way you carry something that has no place to be put down, which is always and everywhere and without rest. And I kept the carrying invisible because that is what the rule required. My mother died in 1872. She was 68 years old, and she died in her bed in the house where she had lived for 40 years. And I was with her in the last days. I sat beside her and I held her hand, and there were long silences between us, of the kind that come between people who have known each other so thoroughly that words are not always necessary. I almost asked her. I came close. 3 times in those last days I formed the question in my mind. Where is Violet? What happened? What did my father do? Why did we never speak of her? And 3 times I let the question dissolve before it reached my mouth, because my mother was dying, and it did not seem right to disturb her dying with the one question I had been forbidden to ask for 26 years. That was a mistake. I know that now. My mother could have told me. She knew. She had been there for all of it. She had sat on that bench with Violet in July of 1845, and she had known what passed between them, and she had kept the rule for 26 years the way I had kept it, and she might have, at the end, been glad to be released from it. I do not know. I let her die without asking. My father died in 1878. He died as he had lived, contained and watchful, and in his final weeks he said little that was not practical, and nothing at all that was personal. He did not mention Violet. I did not mention Violet. The rule held even then, even at the end, and he died with it still in force. And I buried him in the churchyard in Kingston, and stood at his grave and felt the thing. I have felt all my life at the edges of that silence, which is the particular frustration of a question that has no longer any person left to answer it. Clement knew something. I had always believed that. Clement was 3 years older than me and had been 10 when Violet stopped coming, which means he had been old enough to understand more of what was happening than I had been. But Clement had kept the rule as faithfully as I had, and when I tried once in 880 to broach the subject with him, he looked at me with our father's look, the measuring look, and he said there was nothing to discuss and changed the subject, and I let him change it. That was my failure. Not as large as what came after, but a failure nonetheless. I let Clement change the subject in 1880 when I should have pressed him, should have said, Clement, our parents are both dead and the rule died with them, and I have been carrying this for 34 years, and I am going to know what happened even if I have to go to Roane County myself and find whatever is left of the Meade family and ask them directly. I did not say that. I let him change the subject. And 5 years later, in 1885, Clement died of a fever at the age of 50. And the last person who might have known something about Violet was gone. In the summer of 1886, I am 48 years old and a widow of 6 years, my husband James having died in 1880, and I have 4 grown children and a house in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is where James and I had settled, 80 miles from where I was born. And I am sorting through a box of papers that my mother had kept and that had come to me after my father died, and that I had put away without examining because I could not bring myself to examine them. And in the bottom of the box, under letters and receipts, and a daguerreotype of my parents on their wedding day, I find a letter. The letter is from Violet. It is dated October of 1845, 3 months after that July visit. It is addressed to my mother, and it is 6 pages long, and it is the most precise and devastating document I have ever read. I will not tell you everything in it. Some of it is not mine to tell, but I will tell you the shape of it. Violet had come that July to tell my mother that she was leaving Edmund Meade, not because he had harmed her, though there are lines in the letter that suggest the marriage had not been kind. She was leaving because she had in the preceding year come to know a woman in Kingston, a schoolteacher named Ruth Eaton, and the knowing of Ruth Eaton had clarified something for Violet that had been unclear her whole life, which was why every attempt at ordinary happiness, at the ordinary happiness of a wife and a woman in the world of 1845, had felt like wearing a coat that belonged to someone else. She had told my mother all of this on the bench outside the kitchen door in July. My mother had listened, and then my mother had told my father. My father had forbidden Violet the house. That was the rule. That was what we do not speak of. Not a scandal in the conventional sense, not a debt or a crime or a disgrace that could be named in the language the community used for such things. Something that had no name, or had names that were only used as weapons, and that my father had decided was the kind of thing that, if spoken of, would contaminate the household simply by being spoken. He had cut her off. Completely and finally and without, as far as I can tell from the letter, any communication to her of what she had done wrong or how she might undo it. She simply stopped being allowed in the house, and the family closed around the absence, the way water closes around a stone. The letter, the one I found in 1886, was her last attempt to reach my mother. She wrote that she was going north to Cincinnati, where Ruth Eaton had family. She wrote that she understood she could not contact my father. She wrote that she hoped my mother would find some way, when the children were old enough, to tell them she had not disappeared willingly. She wrote that she missed them, both of us, me and Clement, and that she was sorry we would not understand for a long time and might never understand at all. She had understood, at 33 years old, in October of 1845, that the children she loved might never know why she had gone. She was right. I did not know for 41 years. I did not know until I was 48 years old, in sitting alone with a box of papers from a dead woman's house, reading a letter that had been kept in the bottom of that box for 41 years, reading words that were addressed to my mother, and that my mother had read and kept, and never shown me, and never spoken of. My mother had kept the rule too, even in death. I sat in my kitchen in Knoxville for a long time with that letter in my hands. Then I went looking for Violet. She was not easy to find. She had been gone from Tennessee since 1845, 41 years, and I had no address and no reliable information, and only her name and the name of Ruth Eaton and Cincinnati as a place to start. I wrote letters. I wrote to the church records in Cincinnati. I wrote to the county clerk. I wrote to a woman in Rowan County who had known the Meade family and who might know something of where Violet had gone. It took 3 years. 3 years of letters and waiting and dead ends and starting again. In 1889, I received a letter from a woman in Cincinnati whose name was Margaret Eaton, who was Ruth Eaton's niece. She wrote to tell me that her Aunt Ruth had died in 1871, and that Violet Meade had died in 1883, 6 years before I found them, 6 years before I had even begun to look, 6 years before I had even begun to look, 6 years. If I had opened that box in 1883, the year Violet died, instead of waiting until 1886, she might still have been living. Or if I had pressed Clement in 1880 instead of letting him change the subject. Or if I had asked my mother in those last days in 1872, 14 years before I found the letter, when my mother was still there to answer the questions that the letter raised. I had not opened the box. I had not pressed Clement. I had not asked my mother, because the rule said not to. 44 years. From 1845 to 1889, the year I learned she was dead. 44 years of the rule functioning exactly as it was intended to function, which was to remove Violet from our lives so completely that we did not even know to look for her until she had been gone from the earth for 6 years. My father's rule, my mother's compliance with it, Clement's compliance, and mine all those years, my faithful lifelong compliance with a rule I had been given at 7 years old and had obeyed until it was too late for the obeying to cost me anything except everything. That is the shape of it. That is what I have carried for the 38 years since I found that letter. Not guilt in the simple sense, because I was a child when the rule was made, and a child cannot be held to the same account as the adults around her, but something else. The knowledge that I obeyed a rule I should have broken. That the rule was wrong from the beginning, and I knew, in the way you know things you have been told not to know, that it was wrong, and I obeyed it anyway because the habit of obedience was stronger than the knowledge. 38 years. Violet has been dead for 45 years this autumn. I have carried the knowing for 38 of them, and I have never said her name in the hearing of anyone who knew the rule. which means I have obeyed it even in the years since I understood the full cost of it. I am saying her name now. Violet Sailor Mead, born 1848, died 1883 in Cincinnati, Ohio. She deserved better than she got from this family. She deserved better than the silence we gave her, and the erasure we permitted, and the 44 years of not looking for her because we had been told not to speak of her. She was kind. She was full of life. She brought food and laughter and a quality of presence that I have not encountered more than a handful of times in 87 years of living. And she was removed from my life when I was 7 years old by a rule my father made in the space of a Sunday afternoon. And I obeyed that rule until I was too old to do anything with the truth except carry it. It was his fault. The rule was his. But the obeying was mine. And the 41 years of obedience before I found the letter, and the 3 years after the letter, before I learned she was dead, and the 38 years since then of carrying it alone. All of those years are mine too. After I found Violet's letter, I changed what I was willing to obey. Not immediately and not entirely. Old habits of the kind I am describing do not change quickly. But I changed something. My daughter Agnes, who was 22 when I found the letter, had a friend whom I had been watching with the watchful, quiet way I had inherited from my father. I had been watching this friend and finding the same reasons my father found to keep a careful distance, the same wordless judgment, the same wall going up between us and that woman that I now understood had gone up between my father and Violet. And when I recognized in myself what I was doing, I stopped. I did not stop gracefully. I did not stop because I became immediately a more generous and open person than I had been raised to be. I stopped because I found a letter at the bottom of a box and read 6 pages in the voice of a woman my father had erased. And I made a decision that I would not do to my daughter what my father had done to me. Agnes and her friend are still close, 23 years later. Agnes does not know why I changed. I have not told her the whole of it, not yet. But I will. Before I go, I will tell her everything, and I will give her the letter to keep, because it belongs to the family as much as it belongs to me, and more than it belongs to the silence. If you are hearing me, I want to say something to you directly. If there is a rule in your family about someone who is not spoken of, break it. Break it now, today, while the people who made the rule are still alive to ask. Go to them and say, tell me what happened. Tell me who this person was and why we do not speak of them. Tell me the whole truth, because I have a right to know the whole truth about my own family. Do not wait until you are 48 and find in letters at the bottoms of boxes. Do not wait until the people who knew are dead and the only one left to tell you is a niece in Cincinnati writing to say she died 6 years ago. Ask now. Ask while there is still time to ask. Ask while the people who carry the rule are still living and could answer if they chose to. If you gave them the permission to speak, if you made it clear that the silence has cost enough, and you are ready for it to be done, and if you are the one who holds a rule, the one who has forbidden the speaking of a name or the asking of a question, let it go. Whatever the reason for the rule, whatever the thing that made you decide that silence was safer than truth, let it go. The people around you are carrying the silence the way I carried it, at a cost you may not have intended and would not have chosen if you had known the full price. Names should be spoken. People should not be erased. The forbidding of a name does not make the person smaller. It only makes the family that forbids it smaller, more cramped, less than it could have been if it had been willing to hold the whole truth. Say the name. Let the silence in while there is still someone alive who deserves to hear it broken. I dream about Violet. I dream about her often, which makes sense because she was the warmest presence in my early childhood, and the absence of her was the first and deepest wound. In the dream, I am 7 years old again, and it is July, and the hay is cut, and the smell of it is in the air. And she is sitting on the bench outside the kitchen door with her hands folded in her lap and the late afternoon light on her face. In the dream, I go to her. I sit beside her, and I say her name. I say Violet. I say it out loud, which is the one thing I could never do when she was living. The one thing the rule forbade. And in the dream, when I say it, she turns and looks at me with an expression I can only describe as relief. And then I wake up, and she has been dead for 45 years, and I've been forbidden to speak of her for 80 of my 87 years. The one thing I was forbidden to speak about is the one thing I should have said every day. I want to stay with that for a moment because I think it is the most important thing I have said, and I do not want it to pass too quickly. The forbidding of a name is a form of violence. I did not have words for that when I was 7 years old, and I am not certain I would have had them at 30 or 40 either, but I have them now. When my father said we do not speak of her, and my mother fell in line, and Clement fell in line, and I fell in line. What we were all doing was participating in the removal of a person from the world, from our world, which was the only world any of us had. We were saying by our silence that she did not exist, that the July afternoon had not happened, that the bench outside the kitchen door had been empty, that the pies and the preserved things and the laugh that filled a room like weather were nothing, had meant nothing, could be unmade by the simple decision not to speak of them. She had existed. She had loved us. She had held me a moment longer than usual when she said goodbye and told me I was a good girl, and I do not think she was saying it merely as a parting courtesy. I think she was saying it the way you say something to a child you love when you understand you will not see that child again, which is with the full weight of everything you wanted to give them and now cannot. I was a good girl. I kept the rule, and the keeping of it meant I never saw her again. I do not know with certainty what my father believed about Violet, what words he used to himself for the things she had told my mother, whether he used the language of sin or shame or sickness or something else. Men of his time and his faith had available to them a range of words for what Violet had described, and none of those words were kind, and he chose one of them and built his rule on top of it. And I inherited the rule without the reasoning, which meant I carried the prohibition without the ability to examine it, without the chance to hold it up to the light and decide whether it was right. That's as the other thing forbidden speech does. It forbids the examination. You cannot argue with a rule that cannot be named. You cannot bring your own judgment to bear on a thing that has been placed outside the reach of judgment by the simple act of placing it outside the reach of words. My father's rule was a way of making himself the final arbiter of a question he did not want anyone else to consider, and it worked. It worked for 40 years while he was living and for 8 years after he died, until I opened a box of papers and found a letter that gave me back the words he had taken. I think about what I might have done with those years if I had had the words earlier. If my mother had shown me that letter when I was 20, when I had been asking about Violet for years and had not been answered, If Clement had told me in 1880 what he half knew and had been told not to say, if my mother in her last days had decided that dying released her from the rule, any of those moments, any one of them would have given me 20 or 30 years more of looking for Violet, which might have found her living. I do not let myself stay too long in that calculation. It leads nowhere good. What I know is what happened, which is that I found her when she had been dead for 6 years, and I had to sit with the gap between when I could have found her and when I did. And the gap is 6 years wide, and it will always be 6 years wide, and nothing I do now or ever will change that. 38 years since I found the letter, 45 years since she died. And I have spent those 38 years trying to be the kind of woman who does not pass this particular kind of silence to the people she loves. I have been imperfect at it. I have kept other silences in my life that I should not have kept. The habit of obedience is a deep root, and you do not pull it out cleanly in one season. But I have tried, and trying has made me, I think, a more honest woman than I would have been if Violet had stayed erased, if that letter had stayed at the bottom of the box, if I had obeyed the rule all the way to the end of my life without ever knowing what it had cost. It cost me, Violet. It cost her us. It cost my mother whatever peace she might have had if she had been free to speak. It cost Clement something too, though I do not know exactly what, because Clement is gone. And whatever he carried alone the way we all carried things in that family. And it cost 41 years between July of 1845 and October of 1886, when I finally opened a box and found 6 pages in a handwriting I recognized from 40 years before, the handwriting of a woman who had held me in a July afternoon and told me I was a good girl, and then disappeared because my father said we do not speak of her. If there is a rule like that in your family, you now know what it costs. You know because I've just told you. Take that knowledge and use it while you still can. Go to whoever made the rule. Go today. Say, I know there is someone we do not speak of, and I am asking you to speak of them. Say, the silence has lasted long enough. Say, I want to know who they were and what happened and why we have been carrying this in the dark all these years when we could have been carrying it in the light. And if the person who made the rule is gone, go to whoever is still living who knew them. Go to the cousins, the neighbors, the people at the edges of the story who were there but not close enough to be bound by the rule. Someone always knows. Someone always watched from a distance and kept what they saw. Find that person. Ask them. The story is out there, waiting for someone to want it badly enough to look. Because the alternative is finding a letter at the bottom of a box when you are 48 years old and sitting alone in a kitchen and reading the words of someone who loved you and disappeared from your life because a rule was made that she should disappear, and understanding for the first time at 48 what you lost at 7. Do not wait that long. Say the name now. Break the silence now. Do it while the breaking can still give something back. I still hear her laugh sometimes. Not in dreams. In the particular way that very strong early memories return to you when you are old, and the barriers between then and now have grown thin. I hear it in the kitchen when the light is a certain way, that low warm laugh that had nothing mean in it, that was simply the laugh of a person who found the world genuinely delightful, who took pleasure in being alive in it in a way that my father's house had never given me a model for. She was happy. At least she became happy in Cincinnati with Ruth Eaton in whatever life they made together after 1845. Margaret Eaton's letter said her Aunt Ruth had spoken of Violet warmly, and that they had been close until Ruth's death in 1871. 12 years they had together. 12 years of the life she had chosen over the one she had been given. I am glad she had it. I am glad she did not stay in a marriage that was wrong for her, because the leaving was too frightening or the rule too strong. She broke the rule that was placed on her, and she paid for it, and she also got 12 years of something real, something chosen, something that was hers, in a way that her life with Edmund Meade had never been. She was braver than I was. She broke a rule. I kept mine until it kept itself through me. And the one thing I was forbidden to speak about is the last thing I will carry when I close my eyes. I have 6 grandchildren. 5 of them I know well, and one my youngest daughter's youngest boy. I do not know as well as I should, because he lives 3 states away, and we have seen each other only a handful of times. His name is Preston, named for my father, which I did not object to when my daughter chose the name, because I had said I would not make rules about things that belonged to her. But I have thought about it, what it means to give a child the name of a man who made the rule, not because the name itself is wrong. Names are only names. But because the naming passes something forward, some quality of who the man was, and what I want to pass forward is not the rule but the lesson the rule taught me, which is that silence is not protection. Silence is only postponement. The thing you silence does not cease to exist. It waits in boxes and in letters and in the memories of people at the edges of the story, and eventually it is found. And when it is found, the finding happens in the absence of everyone who could have made it gentler. I am going to write a letter to my grandchildren, all 6 of them. I am going to write about Violet. I am going to tell them who she was and what happened and what the rule cost, the way she should have been allowed to tell her own story, but was not, the way my mother should have told it to me, but did not, the way I should have found it and told it sooner, but did not. I am going to put it in writing so that even when I am gone, the silence is still broken, so that there is no letter at the bottom of a box, only a letter at the top of one, left in plain sight by a woman who decided at 87 years old that she was done keeping the rule. That is the one thing I can do. I cannot give them Violet. I cannot give them the July afternoons and the pies and the laugh that filled a room like weather. She is 45 years in the ground, but I can give them her name and her story and the knowledge that she was real and that she was loved and that she should have been allowed to be spoken of her entire life. I owe her that much. I owe it to her that the name my father forbade becomes the name her great-grandnieces and great-grandnephews know, freely, and without the weight of a rule, the way names should be known. Violet Sailor Meade, born 1848 in Rowan County, Tennessee, died 1883 in Cincinnati, Ohio. Beloved by her niece, who was not permitted to love her out loud until it was far too late. I am saying her name out loud now, and I will go on saying it for however many days I have left, because the one thing I was forbidden to speak about for 80 years is the one thing that deserved to be spoken of all along.